All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're tackling a really crucial area for anyone working in radiation oncology, especially if you're navigating residency right now. We're talking about radiation protection and the regulations surrounding it.
Absolutely fundamental stuff.
Think of this session as really digging deep to pull out the absolute essentials you need to know, not just for passing boards, though that's important, but, for the day-to-day safety, for you, your colleagues, and obviously your patients.
Right. This isn't just theoretical physics, it's the practical foundation for safe practice. We'll cover quite a bit. We'll look at the basic ways radiation affects tissue, how we quantify dose for protection purposes, what happens with internal emitters,
The actual regulations, shielding design basics, how we detect radiation.
and then, really importantly, how we handle things when they don't go perfectly, like incidents, and the ethical framework that guides us.
Yeah, it's a big landscape, but
Yeah.
it's all interconnected. This knowledge really is the bedrock, as you said.
Couldn't agree more.
Okay, so let's start at the very beginning. What actually happens biologically when ionizing radiation interacts with living tissue? I know we break it down into like two main categories.
That's right. Broadly speaking, we think about stochastic effects and deterministic effects.
Let's unpack stochastic first. My understanding is that the key word here is random or probabilistic.
Exactly. Stochastic means governed by chance. These effects don't have a definite dose threshold below which they absolutely won't occur. Instead, the probability of the effect occurring increases as the radiation dose increases.
And the main examples we worry about here are things like radiation-induced cancer, right? And also hereditary effects.
Precisely. Cancer induction and genetic effects passed to offspring are the primary stochastic risks we consider in radiation protection.
Okay, so probability goes up with dose. But what about the severity? If someone unfortunately develops a radiation-induced cancer, is it worse if the dose was higher?
That's a critical point. For stochastic effects, the severity of the defect, if it actually happens, is generally considered to be independent of the dose that initiated it. A cancer is a cancer, pathologically speaking, regardless of whether the initiating dose was 10 millisV or 100 millisV. The chance of getting it was higher with the higher dose, but the disease itself isn't necessarily graded by the initial dose in that way.
That's counterintuitive, but really important. And because of that probabilistic nature and the lack of a definite threshold.
For radiation protection purposes, we make a very conservative assumption. We assume that there is no safe dose threshold for stochastic effects.
Meaning any dose, no matter how tiny, carries some theoretical risk.
Correct. It might be an incredibly small risk at low doses, practically negligible compared to other life risks, but we assume it's non-zero. This linear no threshold, or LNT model, is the basis for ALARA and our dose limits for occupational and public exposure. We're managing probability.
Okay, that makes sense for stochastic probability, no threshold assumed, severity independent. Now, what about the other category, deterministic effects?
Right. Deterministic effects, which you might also see called non-stochastic effects, are fundamentally different. These effects do have a clear dose threshold.
Meaning you need to receive a certain minimum dose before the effect even appears.
Exactly. Below that specific threshold dose for a given effect in a given tissue, you simply won't see that clinical effect manifest.
But what happens if you do go above that threshold?
Then, unlike stochastic effects, the severity of the deterministic effect is directly related to the dose received above the threshold. The higher the dose, the more severe the damage.
Can you give some examples of these?
Sure. Think about acute effects like skin erythema, reddening of the skin, or desquamation, which is skin peeling. These only happen above certain doses and get worse with higher doses. Longer-term examples include cataract formation in the lens of the eye, tissue fibrosis or scarring, organ dysfunction or failure if enough cells are killed, and effects on fertility, like temporary or permanent sterility.
So these are effects where we can clearly see a dose-response relationship in terms of severity, but only after crossing that initial threshold.
Precisely. It's usually related to significant cell killing or damage impairing tissue function. And because these effects have thresholds, our dose limits for specific organs, like the lens of the eye or the skin, are set specifically to prevent these deterministic effects from occurring.
Okay, so two very different mechanisms and dose-response relationships. Stochastic, probability, no threshold for protection, severity independent. Deterministic, threshold required, severity increases with dose above threshold. That distinction is key,
Absolutely fundamental. Getting that straight helps understand why we have different types of dose limits.
which brings us nicely to the next point.
Mm-hmm.
How do we actually quantify these doses and risks in a consistent way, especially when dealing with different types of radiation or exposing different parts of the body?
Right. We need specific quantities for radiation protection that go beyond just the physical absorbed dose. We start with absorbed dose, D, which you know is the energy deposited per unit mass. The unit is the gray, 1 gray. 1 gray is 1 joule per kilogram.
But a gray of alpha particles does more biological damage than a gray of X-rays, right?
Right.
Especially for those stochastic effects.
Exactly. That's where dose equivalent H comes in. It's designed to put different types of radiation on an equivalent footing in terms of their potential to cause stochastic harm. We calculate it by taking the absorbed dose D in gray and multiplying it by a radiation weighting factor, which we denote as W sub R. So the formula is H equals dW sub R.
And the unit for dose equivalent isn't gray anymore, it's...
Sievert, SV, that's the SI unit. You'll still sometimes see the older unit, the rem, especially in US regulations. The conversion is easy. 1 sievert equals 100 rem, so 50 millisieverts is 5 rem.
Okay, so this W sub R factor adjusts for the biological effectiveness. What are some typical values?
They're standardized in reports like NCRP 116, for photons like X-rays and gamma rays, and for electrons and beta particles, W sub R is set to 1. They are the reference radiation.
Makes sense. What about particles?
For protons with energy greater than 2 MeV, the W sub R used for protection is typically 2, although the actual relative biological effectiveness, or RBE, can vary and sometimes be higher, up to around 5 depending on energy and endpoint. Neutrons are more complicated. Their W sub R depends strongly on their energy. It ranges from about 5 for low-energy thermal neutrons up to 20 for high-energy fast neutrons.
And the really damaging ones, like alpha particles.
Alpha particles and other heavy ions, because they create very dense ionization tracks, are given the highest W sub R value of 20. They're considered 20 times more effective at inducing stochastic effects per gray than photons are.
So dose equivalent helps us compare apples and oranges radiation-wise. 1 sievert of neutrons is considered to carry the same stochastic risk as 1 sievert of photons.
That's the idea. It's a protection quantity, normalizing risk across radiation types.
Okay, but what if the exposure isn't uniform? Like maybe just the hands get a dose during a procedure, or one organ gets irradiated in nuclear medicine. How do we estimate the overall risk to the whole person in those situations?
Yeah.
Dose equivalent is tissue-specific, right?
Exactly. That's where effective dose E comes into play. Effective dose is a calculated quantity designed to estimate the overall stochastic risk to the entire body from a non-uniform radiation exposure.
How does it do that?
It takes into account that different organs and tissues have different sensitivities to radiation-induced stochastic effects, primarily fatal cancer risk, but also considering non-fatal cancer and hereditary effects. The calculation involves summing up the dose equivalents received by all the significant tissues and organs in the body, but each tissue's dose equivalent is multiplied by a specific tissue weighting factor, W sub T, before summing.
So the formula looks like E equals the sum of H for each tissue times W sub T for that tissue.
Precisely. E equals the HT WT. The sum of all the tissue weighting factors, WT, is normalized to equal 1 for the whole body.
What tissues are considered most sensitive? What gets the highest W sub T?
According to the current recommendations, the gonads, testis ovaries, have the highest weighting factor, reflecting the concern for hereditary effects. Then you have a group of tissues with relatively high sensitivity, including red bone marrow, risk of leukemia, colon, lung, stomach, and breast.
They have the least sensitive.
Tissues like the bone surface and the skin have much lower tissue weighting factors. They contribute less to the overall fatal cancer risk compared to, say, the lung or colon for the same dose equivalent.
So by using these weighting factors, effective dose gives us a single number, also in sieverts.
Yes, also in sieverts.
That represents the equivalent uniform whole body dose that would carry the same overall stochastic risk as the actual non-uniform exposure.
That's a perfect way to put it. It allows us to compare risks from vastly different exposure scenarios, like comparing the risk from inhaling a radionuclide that concentrates in the lungs versus the risk from an external exposure primarily to the chest. It's a risk-related quantity, not a direct physical measurement.
Okay, that clarifies those key protection quantities. Dose equivalent H for radiation type, effective dose E for tissue sensitivity and non-uniform exposure. Now, let's shift focus a bit. What about situations where the radioactive material actually gets inside the body, internal dosimetry?
Right, that's a whole different challenge because the source is now within the person, potentially irradiating tissues continuously until it decays or is eliminated.
When we talk about the amount of radioactivity inside someone, what's the term for that?
That's called body burden. It's simply the quantity of a specific radionuclide present within the body at any given time.
And the units would be activity units like.
Exactly. Microcuries or megabecquerels,
I
MBQ.
remember hearing about something called the maximal permissible body burden, or MPBB. Is that still used?
That's an older concept related to earlier dose limits. It represented the activity of a radionuclide continuously present in the body that would result in the maximum permissible dose rate to a critical organ or the whole body. While you might encounter the term, current regulations are generally framed around concepts like the annual limit on intake, ALI, which is derived from the primary dose limits like the 50 millisy effective dose limit. ALI is the amount you could intake in a year that would lead to that limit, but understanding body burden as the amount present is still relevant.
When a radionuclide is inside the body, its activity decreases not just from radioactive decay, but also because the body gets rid of it, right?
Absolutely. We have to consider both physical decay and biological clearance. This combined effect is described by the effective half-life, T effective.
So it's different from the physical half-life, T physical, listed in charts.
Yes. T physical is just how long it takes for half the atoms to decay radioactively. Biological half-life, T biological, is how long it takes for the body to eliminate half of the substance through biological processes like excretion or metabolism, assuming it wasn't radioactive. The effective half-life combines these two processes. The formula that relates them is 1 over T effective equals 1 over T physical plus 1 over T biological.
1 over T effective equals 1 over T physical plus 1 over T biological.
Okay. And looking at that formula, since you're adding rates of removal,
The effective half-life, T effective, will always be shorter than either T physical or T biological alone. Both processes are working together to reduce the amount of radionuclide present in the body or a specific organ.
can you give an example?
Sure, a classic one is iodine-131 used for thyroid treatments. Its physical half-life is about 8 days. If it gets taken up by the thyroid gland, the thyroid has a biological half-life for iodine of, let's say, around 24 days on average, though it varies.
So plugging 8 days and 24 days into the formula, 1 over T effective equals 18 plus 124 plus 124 plus 124 equals 16. So T effective is 6 days.
So the radioactivity in the thyroid decreases with a half-life of 6 days, faster than the 8-day physical decay, because the thyroid is also clearing iodine biologically.
Exactly. This is crucial for calculating the total dose delivered over time from an internal emitter.
And how do we actually calculate that dose to specific organs from these internal sources? It seems complicated.
It can be. The standard approach used, especially in nuclear medicine dosimetry, is the AIR-RD formalism. AIR-RD stands for the Medical Internal Radiation Dose Committee, which developed this system.
What's the basic idea behind ARRD?
It provides a structured method to calculate the absorbed dose. It involves identifying source organs, that's where the radionuclide is actually located or distributed, and target organs, which are the organs for which you want to calculate the absorbed dose. An organ can be both a source and a target, receiving dose from the activity within itself, self-dose, as well as dose from activity in other source organs, cross-dose.
So it accounts for the radiation traveling from one organ to another.
Yes, it uses things called S factors, or absorbed fractions, that represent the fraction of energy emitted by the source organ that gets absorbed by the target organ, considering the type and energy of radiation and the geometry of the organs. It's quite sophisticated, but provides standardized dose estimates.
Okay, switching gears slightly back to practical safety. What if someone gets radioactive material on them, like a skin contamination? Any quick tips?
Yes, a key practical point, a clinical pearl, if you will. If dealing with skin contamination, the standard advice is to wash the area gently with soap and lukewarm or cool water, not hot water.
Why not hot water?
Hot water can increase blood flow to the skin surface, potentially enhancing the systemic absorption of the radioactive material through the skin into the bloodstream. Cool or lukewarm water minimizes this risk while still helping to remove the contaminant.
Good tip. And you mentioned iodine-131 earlier. Is there anything specific for potential internal exposure to radioactive iodine?
Yes, another important practical measure. If there's a risk of inhaling and ingesting significant amounts of radioactive iodine, administering stable, non-radioactive potassium iodide, Ki, promptly can be very effective.
How does that work?
The stable iodide floods the thyroid gland, effectively blocking the uptake of the radioactive iodine that might enter the bloodstream. The thyroid can only take up so much iodine at once, so if it's saturated with stable iodine, the radioactive form is less likely to be absorbed and will be excreted more quickly, dramatically reducing the dose to the thyroid. Timing is critical, though. It needs to be given before or very shortly after exposure.
Okay, so we've covered the basic science, the dose quantities, internal dosimetry concepts.
Right.
Now let's get into the nitty-gritty of the rules and regulations that govern our daily practice.
Right. The overarching philosophy here is ALARA.
As low as reasonably achievable.
Exactly. It's not just about staying below the legal limits, it's a mindset. We have an obligation to actively minimize radiation doses whenever possible without compromising the necessary medical information or therapeutic effect, of course.
And the practical ways we achieve ALARI usually boil down to three things.
The three cardinal principles: time, distance, and shielding.
Minimize the time you spend near a source of radiation.
Maximize your distance from the source. Remember the inverse square law: doubling your distance cuts the dose rate to 1/4. It's incredibly effective.
And use appropriate shielding placing, absorbing materials like lead or concrete between you and the source.
Those three are the cornerstones of practical radiation safety day to day.
To put the regulatory limits we're about to discuss into context, it's probably helpful to remember how much radiation we get just from living on Earth. What's the typical background radiation level?
Yeah, that's a good benchmark. The average annual effective dose from background radiation in the United States is estimated to be around 6 millisieverts, or 600 millirem per year.
Wow, 6 millisieverts. And where does that come from?
It's roughly a 50-50 split between natural sources and man-made sources.
Natural sources be...
The biggest single contributor by far is radon gas, which comes from the natural decay of uranium in soil and rock. Radon inhalation accounts for something like 56% of the natural background dose, or well over a third of the total background dose. Other natural sources include cosmic radiation from space, terrestrial radiation from radioactive elements in the ground itself, like uranium, thorium, potassium, and radionuclides naturally present inside our bodies, mainly potassium-40.
Okay, so radon is the big one naturally. What about the man-made half?
The largest contributor there is medical procedures. Diagnostic X-rays account for about 11% of the total average background dose, and nuclear medicine procedures contribute another 4% or so. Other man-made sources like consumer products, industrial uses, and fallout are much smaller contributors nowadays.
So around 3 mSv natural, 3 mSv man-made, mostly medical, for a total of about 6 mSv per year on average. Good to keep in mind when we hear the occupational limits.
Exactly. It provides perspective.
All right, let's dive into those critical regulatory dose limits. These are the numbers set by bodies like the NCRP and enforced by regulators like the NRC in the U.S. And importantly, these limits are in addition to background radiation and any medical doses you receive yourself, right?
Correct. These limits apply specifically to dose received as a result of licensed activities, basically, your occupational exposure or exposure to the public from those activities.
Okay, first, the limits for occupational limits for adults working with radiation. What's the main annual limit?
The annual limit for the total effective dose equivalent, TD, is 50 millisieverts, 50 millisv. That's equivalent to 5 rem.
And TEAG includes both external dose and internal dose from any intake.
Yes. TEAD is the sum of the deep dose equivalent from external sources and the committed effective dose equivalent from internal uptakes over a year. It's the primary limit for overall stochastic risk.
What about specific parts of the body, like the eyes?
The annual limit for the dose equivalent to the lens of the eye is also 50 millisieverts, 50 millisv, or 5 rem per year, same as the TD limit under current U.S. NRC regs. Although it's worth noting some international bodies now recommend a lower limit of 20 millis a year, averaged over 5 years, based on newer data suggesting cataracts might occur at lower cumulative doses than previously thought. But the U.S. legal limit is currently 50 millisv.
Okay, 50 for teeth, 50 for the lens. What about hands, feet, skin, or other individual organs? So if I'm handling sources, my hands might get more dose.
Right. For deterministic effects in specific tissues, the limits are higher. The annual limit for the total organ dose equivalent, TOD, to any individual organ or tissue other than the lens, and also specifically for the skin and extremities, hands, forearms, feet, ankles, is 500 millisieverts, 500 millisievert or 50 rem per year.
Wow, 10 times higher than the effective dose limit.
Yes, because those limits are primarily aimed at preventing deterministic effects in those tissues, which have higher thresholds, rather than limiting overall stochastic risk, which drives the T to limit.
Is there a lifetime limit too?
Yes, there's a cumulative limit intended as a check. The cumulative effective dose equivalent over a worker's lifetime should ideally not exceed 10 millisieverts times the worker's age in years, 10 millis v age, or in old units, 1 rem times age in years.
Okay, those are the occupational limits. 50
Yeah.
millisecat TEED, 50 millis v lens, 500 millis v organ skin extremities, and 10 millis times age cumulative. What about members of the public? People in areas outside the radiation-controlled zones.
The limits for the public are much lower, reflecting the involuntary nature of their exposure and the larger population size. The annual effective dose equivalent limit for continuous or frequent public exposure is 1 millisievert, 1 millis v, or 100 millis per year.
So 50 times lower than the occupational limit.
Correct. And there's also a constraint on the dose rate in unrestricted areas. The dose in any 1 hour must not exceed 0.02 millisieverts, 0.02 millisieverts and 2 millisieverts. This prevents higher short-term exposures, even if the annual total might be met.
What about pregnant workers? Once a worker declares their pregnancy in writing, special limits apply to protect the developing embryo or fetus.
Yes, the fetus is considered particularly sensitive to radiation. The regulatory limit on the total dose equivalent to the embryo fetus over the entire gestation period is 5 millisieverts, 5 millis v, or 500 rem.
5 millisieverts for the whole pregnancy.
Right. And to help ensure this limit is met smoothly, there's also regulatory guidance, not a strict limit, but strong guidance that the dose should not exceed 0.5 millisieverts, 0.5 millis, or 50 millim in any given month of the pregnancy.
Okay, 5 millis v total term limit, with 0.5 millis v monthly guidance for declared pregnant workers. These dose limits are absolutely crucial to know.
You absolutely have to know these numbers. They come up constantly in practice and on exams. 50 occupational, 1 public, 5 for the fetus. Those are the big annual term effective dose numbers to nail down.
To help enforce these limits and communicate hazards, we use specific signs. How are radiation areas defined and signposted?
The signage requirements are based on the potential dose rate someone could receive if they were in that area. The measurements are typically specified at 30 centimeters from the source or surface.
Okay, so what defines a radiation area?
A radiation area requires a sign, usually magenta or black trefoil on yellow background with the words "Caution, Radiation Area." If the dose rate exceeds 0.05 millisieverts, 0.05 millisieverts in 1 hour at 30 centimeters, that's 5 millirem per hour.
So relatively low levels, but enough that access should be controlled. What's the next level up?
A high radiation area. This requires a sign saying "Caution, High Radiation Area" or "Danger, High Radiation Area" if the dose rate exceeds 1 millisievert, 1 millisieverts, in 1 hour at 30 centimeters. That's 100 millirem per hour.
And these areas usually have extra controls, right?
Yes, entry into high radiation areas typically requires specific procedures, often involving interlocks, alarms, or direct surveillance to prevent unauthorized or accidental entry when the radiation levels are high.
Is there anything beyond high radiation area?
Yes, the most hazardous level is a very high radiation area. The sign usually says grave danger, very high radiation area. This is defined based on the absorbed dose rate, specifically where an individual could receive an absorbed dose greater than 5 gray, 5 GI, in 1 hour at 1 meter from the source or from any surface the radiation beam passes through.
5 grays in an hour. That's an enormous, potentially lethal dose.
Exactly. These areas are extremely dangerous and require very stringent controls, usually multiple independent interlocks and safety features, to prevent anyone from being present when the source is exposed. Think inside the treatment head path or beam path directly.
And before all that, we have controlled areas, which are areas where occupational exposure is supervised and kept below limits, typically aiming for less than 1 millisievert per week, or 0.1 millisievert week actually is the occupational monitored limit.
Right. Access is controlled, but it doesn't automatically require a specific radiation area sign unless those dose rate thresholds are exceeded.
Okay, beyond dose limits and signs, there are tons of administrative requirements for handling radioactive materials safely. What about written directives? When are they absolutely required?
Written directives are like super prescriptions, required for specific high-risk therapeutic procedures to ensure accuracy and prevent errors. The NRC mandates a written directive for all brachytherapy procedures regardless of dose.
Every single brachy case needs one. What about unsealed sources, like radiopharmaceuticals?
A written directive is required for the therapeutic administration of unsealed radionuclides if the administered activity exceeds certain thresholds, generally defined as greater than 1.01 megabecquerels (MBq), which is 30 microcuries, or if the dose delivered is considered therapeutic. So this definitely applies to common therapies like iodine-131 for thyroid cancer or hyperthyroidism, radium-223 Xofigo, yttrium-90 microspheres, lutetium-177 therapies like Lutathera.
But probably not for standard diagnostic scans, even peak ET with F18 FDG.
Correct. Standard diagnostic doses, like for F18 FDG PET scans, typically do not require a written directive because they fall below the therapeutic threshold activity or are considered diagnostic, not therapeutic intent.
And what information absolutely has to be on that written directive?
It needs to be very specific. The patient's name, the radionuclide, the prescribed dose or dose range, the route of administration, the treatment site. For brachytherapy, it also includes details like the dose per fraction, number of fractions, total dose, and specifics about the sources like strength and treatment time. It has to be dated and signed by an authorized user physician before the administration.
And record keeping. How long do we generally need to keep records like calibrations or leak tests?
The general rule for many routine records required by the NRC, like survey meter calibrations, sealed source leak tests and inventories, radioactive material receipt and disposal records, is that they must be maintained for 3 years. Some records, like patient dose records or personnel dosimetry records, often need to be kept much longer, sometimes indefinitely or for the duration of the license.
What about the instruments we use to measure radiation? The survey meters. How often do they need calibration?
Survey instruments must be calibrated before their first use, annually thereafter, and also following any repair that might affect their calibration. You need documentation proving they were calibrated correctly against a traceable standard.
How do we verify the activity of sources we use?
It depends on the type. For unsealed sources, like that therapeutic dose of I-131 liquid or capsules, the activity must be directly measured in a dose calibrator just before administration, and that measured activity must be compared to the prescribed activity on the written directive within specific tolerances, usually plus minus 20%. For sealed sources, like HDR brachytherapy sources or teletherapy sources, the activity is typically certified by the manufacturer. The facility verifies this upon receipt. For subsequent uses, the activity is calculated based on radioactive decay from the initial certified value using the known half-life.
And machine calibrations, like for an HDR afterloader.
HDR afterloaders require dosimetric calibration quarterly, every 3 months, and also after every source exchange. Older teletherapy units like Cobalt-60 machines require annual calibration. LANX, of course, have very extensive daily, monthly, and annual QA procedures mandated by regulations and professional guidelines, including regular output calibration checks.
You mentioned sealed sources. What are the routine checks needed for them?
2 key things, done periodically. Leak testing and physical inventory. Both need to be performed every 6 months for most sealed sources used in medicine.
Leak testing is to make sure they aren't leaking radioactive material.
Exactly. A wipe test is done on the source or its housing, and the wipe is counted. The source is considered to be leaking if the test reveals the presence of greater than or equal to 0.005 microcurie Ci of removable radioactive contamination. That's equivalent to 185 becquerels. BQ.
0.005 microcuries. That's the magic number for a failed leak test.
That's the one to remember. And the physical inventory, also every 6 months, is just what it sounds like. Physically verifying that every licensed sealed source is accounted for and in its assigned location.
When can patients who've had permanent radioactive implants, like prostate seeds, be released?
The regulation states that a patient with a permanent implant can be released if the total effective dose equivalent to any other individual from exposure to that patient is not likely to exceed 5 millisieverts. 5 millisieverts.
So it's based on the potential dose to others, not just the activity remaining in the patient.
Correct. It involves calculations based on the remaining activity, the radionuclides emissions and half-life, and assumptions about how close other people might be and for how long. Often, specific instructions are given to the patient to limit close contact for a period.
One more regulatory detail, those shipping labels on packages with radioactive materials. White I, yellow 2, yellow 3. How are they determined?
They're based on the measured radiation levels at 2 points, the package surface and at 1 meter from the surface.
Okay, what's white I?
White R is for packages with very low external radiation levels. The dose rate at the surface must be less than or equal to 0.5 millicurie each R. which is bam 0.005 millicurie, and D, the radiation level at 1 meter must be essentially undetectable or background.
Got it. Low level. What about yellow 2?
Yellow 2 is the intermediate level. The surface dose rate must be less than or equal to 50 millirr, 0.5 millirr, and D, the dose rate at 1 meter must be less than or equal to 1 LRR, 0.01 millirr.
Okay, surface equal 50, AD 1 meter equal 1. And yellow 3. Yellow 3 is for packages exceeding either of the yellow 2 limits. So if the surface dose rate is greater than 50 millirr, the dose rate at 1 meter is greater than 1 millirr, it requires a yellow 3 label.
And that dose rate at 1 meter has a special name.
Yes, the dose rate in MRR at 1 meter is called the transportation index, TI. For yellow 2 and yellow 3 packages, the TI value must be written on the label. It helps freight handlers determine safe storage distances. That's a classic board question scenario. Knowing those thresholds is key.
Yeah.
Okay. That's a dense but critical overview of the regulatory landscape. Let's shift gears slightly again and talk about designing the rooms themselves. Treatment room, shielding. How do we figure out how thick the walls need to be?
Right. Shielding calculations are a core part of medical physics. We need to ensure that the dose rates outside the treatment room, in occupied areas, are below those public or occupational limits we just discussed.
What factors go into that calculation?
There are several key parameters, often remembered by the acronym WUT-PDD. W is for workload. This quantifies how much the machine is used, typically in terms of dose delivered at a reference point per week, e.g. gray per week at 1 meter, or sometimes beam on time or MU delivered per week. It reflects the machine's usage intensity.
U is the use factor. This is the fraction of the total workload for which the primary beam is likely to be pointed towards a specific barrier, wall, floor, ceiling. For secondary barriers shielding against scatter and leakage, U is always taken as 1.
T is the occupancy factor. This represents the fraction of time that the area outside the barrier being calculated is actually occupied by people. A control console or office would have T or 1, full occupancy, whereas a rooftop or a rarely used storage closet might have a much lower T, like 120 or 140.
P is the permissible dose limit. This is the design dose rate goal for the occupied area outside the barrier, based on whether it's a controlled area, typically 0.1 millisv week, or an unrestricted public area, typically 0.02 millisv week, though often designed to be even lower.
And finally, D is the distance from the radiation source, like the LINAC isocenter and target, to the point where you're calculating the dose just outside the barrier.
So WUTPD, workload, use, occupancy permissible limit, distance, how do they fit together?
They're used to calculate the required barrier transmission factor, B. This B represents how much the radiation intensity needs to be reduced by the barrier. Conceptually, for a primary barrier, the formula looks something like B PD2 WT.
B equals PD squared over WUT.
Right. The PD2 term represents the dose rate limit scaled by distance squared, inverse square law, and the WT term represents the effective radiation output directed towards that point.
So you calculate the needed transmission B, and then use data for concrete or lead to figure out how many centimeters thick the barrier needs to be to achieve that transmission.
Exactly. You use attenuation data, often expressed in terms of half-value layers, HVLs, or 10th-value layers, TVLs, for the specific radiation, energy, and shielding material to find the thickness corresponding to the calculated B value.
What about secondary barriers, shielding from scatter and leakage?
For secondary barriers, you calculate the required thickness separately for the leakage radiation component, coming through the LINAC head, and the scattered radiation component, scattering off the patient. Then you compare the two required thicknesses. A common conservative rule of thumb is, if the thickness required for scatter and the thickness required for leakage are within 1 TVL of each other, you should take the thicker of the two and add 1 HVL of extra shielding material to it. If they differ by more than a TVL, you generally just use the thicker of the two calculations.
Okay, so calculate both, compare, maybe add an HVL. Now, what about higher energy machines? You mentioned neutrons earlier. When do we need specific neutron shielding?
Neutron production becomes significant in the LINAC head components, like the target flattening filter JAWS, when the accelerating electron energy exceeds about 10 megavolts, 10 MV, due to giant dipole resonance photonuclear reactions.
So for machines running at 15 MV, 18 MV, neutron shielding is a must.
Yes, and neutrons are tricky to shield. You need materials containing light nuclei, especially hydrogen, to thermalize, slow down the fast neutrons, and then a material with a high neutron capture cross-section, like boron-10, to absorb the thermal neutrons without producing too many high-energy capture gamma rays.
What materials do we typically use?
Borated polyethylene, BPE, is common. The polyethylene provides the hydrogen for thermalization, and the boron provides the neutron capture. Sometimes concrete itself provides sufficient shielding, if thick enough, or specialized concrete formulations are used. Lead is also often incorporated mainly for the photon shielding component and to absorb capture gammas.
Does the order of materials matter, like in the maze door?
It can.
Yeah.
For the main vault door, often at the end of a maze entrance, the typical design is BPE first on the maze side, followed by lead on the outside. The idea is that neutrons scattering down the maze get thermalized by the BPE first, then captured. The lead then attenuates the captured gamma rays produced in the BPE and any primary photons scattering down the maze.
BPE, then lead for the door. What about if the primary beam could hit a wall at 10 MV?
That's less common design-wise, but if a primary barrier needs neutron fielding, the order might be reversed. Lead first to significantly attenuate the primary high-energy photons, followed by BPE to deal with the photoneutrons generated in the lead and target. The photon shielding is often the dominant need for the primary barrier thickness itself.
Does using techniques like IMRT, which use a lot more monitor units and MU for the same delivered dose, affect shielding design?
Absolutely. High MU techniques like IMRT or VMAT significantly increase the beam-on time for a given patient dose compared to conventional 3D conformal treatments. This means the leakage radiation component from the LINAC head becomes much more dominant in the secondary barrier calculations. The primary barrier calculation, WT part, isn't directly affected by MU per se if the dose per fraction is the same, but the secondary barrier shielding, especially for leakage, often needs to be substantially thicker for rooms heavily used for IMRT compared to older designs. Workload calculations must properly account for this increased leakage contribution.
And where exactly are we calculating the dose to when we do these calculations? The point of interest.
The standard protection point for calculation is usually taken to be 0.3 meters, or about 1 foot beyond the finished outer surface of the barrier being assessed.
Okay, shielding design is complex but crucial. Now, how do we actually know if radiation is present? How do we detect and measure it? Let's talk radiation detection.
The workhorses for general survey and measurement in radiation oncology are often gas-filled detectors.
How do they work fundamentally?
The basic principle is straightforward. They have a volume of gas enclosed between two electrodes. When ionizing radiation passes through the gas, it knocks electrons off the gas molecules, creating pairs of positive ions and free electrons. An electrical voltage is applied across the electrodes. This electric field causes the electrons to drift towards the positive electrode, anode, and the positive ions towards the negative electrode, cathode.
And that movement of charge is the signal.
Exactly. The collection of these charges creates a very small electrical current or a pulse, which can then be amplified and measured. The key thing is that the detector's response, how big the signal is for a given amount of radiation, depends dramatically on the voltage applied across those electrodes.
Right. I remember seeing a graph of detector response versus voltage with different regions. Can you walk us through those?
Sure. It's often called the six-region curve. At very low voltages, region 1, recombination region, the electric field is too weak. The electrons and ions tend to just recombine back into neutral molecules before they reach the electrodes. You collect very little charge, so it's useless for detection.
Okay, need more voltage. What's next?
Increase the voltage into the ion chamber region, regions again, typically 100, 300 volts. Here, the voltage is strong enough to collect virtually all the primary electron-ion pairs created by the radiation before they can recombine. Importantly, there's no multiplication of charge in this region. The collected charge is directly proportional to the total ionization produced by the radiation in the gas volume.
So the signal is proportional to the energy deposited, or the dose rate.
Exactly. This makes ion chambers ideal for quantitative dose measurements. The survey meters we use for accurate dose rate readings and the thimble chambers used for calibrating LINAC output all operate in this stable ion chamber region.
Okay, ion chamber region for accurate dose. What if we crank up the voltage more?
Now we enter the proportional region, region third, 300, 500 volts. Here, the electric field is strong enough that the primary electrons, as they drift towards the anode, gain enough energy to knock off additional electrons from other gas molecules. This is called gas amplification, or the Townsend avalanche. The collected charge is now multiplied, giving a larger signal. Crucially, the total charge collected is state proportional to the initial number of ion pairs created by the incident radiation event.
So bigger signal, still proportional. Any advantages?
Yes, the larger signal makes it easier to detect low-energy radiation. And because the output is proportional to the initial ionization, proportional counters can actually distinguish between different types of radiation that create different amounts of initial ionization, like alpha particles versus beta particles. They're used more in laboratory settings.
Interesting. What's after proportional?
Keep increasing the voltage, and you hit the Geiger-Müller GM region, region V, 500, 1500 volts. Note, the outline mentions region 4 for GM, but typically proportional is third, limited proportional is 4, and GM is V. I'll follow the common V convention. In the GM region, the voltage is so high that even a single primary ionization event triggers a massive cascade or avalanche of ionization that spreads along the entire length of the anode wire. The result is a very large, easily detectable electrical pulse. Importantly, the size of this pulse is independent of the energy or type of the initial radiation event that triggered it. The whole detector volume essentially discharges.
So any event, big or small, give the same big pulse.
Pretty much. This makes GM counters extremely sensitive for detecting the mere presence of radiation, even very low levels. That's why they are great as survey meters for contamination checks or finding small sources.
But if every pulse is the same size, they can't measure dose rate accurately, right?
Correct. They are not good for quantitative dose rate measurements. They basically just count events. Also, after each pulse, the detector needs a short time to recover, the dead time or refractory period, during which it can't detect another event. At high radiation levels, they can become saturated and give erroneously low readings or even paralyze. So, great for detection, poor for measurement.
Okay, GM for sensitive detection. Is there a region after GM?
Yes, if you keep increasing the voltage, region 6, continuous discharge region, the electric field becomes so intense that the gas breaks down and conducts continuously, like a spark, even without any external radiation. The detector is useless, possibly damaged.
So the key operating regions are ion chamber for measurement and GM for detection.
Those are the two main types of gas-filled survey meters you'll encounter daily.
Are there other important detector types besides gas-filled ones?
Oh, definitely. Scintillation detectors are very important, especially in nuclear medicine and radiation monitoring.
How do they work?
They use special materials called scintillators. A common one is a crystal of sodium iodide doped with thallium, written Na, Tl. When radiation interacts with the scintillator material, it excites the atoms, and they then de-excite by emitting tiny flashes of visible light, scintillations. This light is then detected, usually by a sensitive device called a photomultiplier tube, PMT, which converts the light flash into an electrical pulse and amplifies it significantly.
Are they sensitive?
Extremely sensitive, especially for detecting gamma rays. They form the basis of gamma cameras, PET scanners, well counters used for sample analysis, and some sensitive survey meters.
What about detecting neutrons? We talked about needing neutron shielding. How do we detect them?
Neutron detection is trickier because neutrons are uncharged. We usually detect them indirectly. A common type of neutron detector uses a gas-filled counter, often operating in the proportional or GM region, but the gas is something like boron trifluoride, BF3, or the walls are coated with boron-10. When a thermal slow neutron is captured by a boron-10 nucleus, it causes a nuclear reaction N alpha that releases an energetic alpha particle and a lithium nucleus. It's this charged alpha particle that then ionizes the gas and gets detected by the counter mechanism. So you're detecting the secondary charged particle produced by the neutron interaction. Other methods use proton recoil and hydrogenous scintillators.
Okay, so we know how to detect radiation. Let's move into the final section. What happens when things go wrong and the ethical principles that guide our profession. Let's talk incidents, ethics, and professionalism.
This is incredibly important. First, understanding what constitutes a reportable medical event, sometimes called a misadministration, according to the NRC or state regulations.
It's not just any error, right? There are specific thresholds.
Correct. For an error to be classified as a reportable medical event, it generally needs to meet criteria related to both the dose delivered and the nature of the error. Specifically, a key threshold is if the dose delivered differs from the prescribed dose by more than 20% for the total dose, or if a single fraction dose is off by more than 50%, or if the dose delivered results in a total organ dose equivalent, TOD, exceeding 0.5 SV, 50 rem, to an organ or tissue, or an effective dose equivalent exceeding 0.05 SEA5 rem. And there has to be a significant delivery error, such as delivering the dose to the wrong patient, using the wrong radiopharmaceutical, delivering to the wrong body site if the difference is significant, or using the wrong mode of treatment. It often requires both a dose consequence and a process error.
So a dose error over a certain limit PLUS, a specific type of mistake.
Yes, and if a medical event occurs, the reporting requirements are strict. The NRC must be notified by telephone no later than the next calendar day after discovery, and a detailed written report must be submitted within 15 days.
Next day phone call, 15-day written report. Got it. How do we learn from mistakes or near misses to prevent future incidents?
That's where incident learning systems come in. A crucial one in our field is ROILS, Radiation Oncology Incident Learning System, sponsored by ASTRO and AAPM.
What is ROILS?
It's a confidential, voluntary, web-based system where radiation oncology practices can report errors, near misses, and unsafe conditions without fear of punitive action. The data is anonymized and aggregated nationally
And the purposes?
to identify patterns, vulnerabilities, and common failure modes across the field. By analyzing these events, ROILS can share lessons learned and best practice recommendations to improve safety for everyone.
Does the data show common causes of errors?
Yes, the material mentions that miscommunication between team members is frequently identified as a contributing factor or root cause in reported events. This really highlights the importance of clear, unambiguous communication protocols like readbacks, standardized handoffs, and pre-treatment timeouts or huddles.
Where are most potential errors caught?
Encouragingly, analysis often shows that a significant number of potential errors are intercepted during routine pre-treatment quality assurance (QA) procedures, like chart checks, physics plan reviews, and machine QA. This underscores just how vital those QA steps are as safety nets.
And if an event does happen, a thorough analysis is needed.
Absolutely. A good root cause analysis, RCA, investigates not just what happened, but why it happened, looking at systems factors, processes, human factors, etc. A comprehensive RCA report typically includes a clear definition of the event, an analysis of causality, identifying contributing factors and root causes, an assessment of the actual or potential severity, process maps to visualize the workflow, and relevant data elements.
Beyond incidents, there's the broader context of professionalism and ethics. What are the guiding principles?
Professional societies like AAPM have codes of ethics, and reports like TG109 address ethics for medical physicists. The absolute cornerstone, the prime directive, is that the patient's best interest is primary.
Everything flows from that.
Yes. All professional judgments, decisions, and actions must prioritize the well-being and safety of the patient above all other considerations, including personal convenience, financial gain, or institutional pressures.
What about conflicts of interest?
Professionals have an ethical obligation to identify, disclose, and manage any potential conflicts of interest. This could be financial relationships with vendors, research funding sources, or any other situation where personal interests might reasonably appear to influence professional judgment. Transparency is key.
And what about our scope of practice?
This is critical. We have an ethical duty to practice only within our areas of competence, based on our education, training, and experience. Furthermore, we must ensure we have the necessary resources, equipment, staffing, protocols to perform procedures safely and effectively according to established standards of care.
So if you feel the resources are inadequate for a particular procedure,
You have an ethical obligation to speak up. You should advocate for the necessary resources. If they aren't available, you need to define the limits of what can be done safely under the current circumstances, or potentially recommend that the patient be referred to another center that is adequately equipped. You cannot ethically proceed if you believe it's unsafe.
that takes courage sometimes.
It does, but it's a fundamental professional responsibility. Patient safety cannot be compromised.
What about ethics in research?
Research involving human subjects is governed by strict ethical principles, historically codified in documents like the Nuremberg Code, the Declaration of Helsinki, and the Belmont Report in the U.S. Key principles include informed consent, minimizing risks, ensuring benefits outweigh risks, and equitable subject selection. Institutional review boards, IRBs, oversee research ethics. For research involving animals, the principle of the 3 Rs applies. Replacement, use non-animal alternatives whenever possible. Reduction, use the minimum number of animals necessary to obtain valid results. And refinement, minimize any pain, suffering, or distress to the animals.
Okay, that ties together the technical, regulatory, and ethical dimensions. Let's try to distill this down. If you had to pick the absolute Key takeaways from all this material, the stuff residents really need, burned into their memory for boards and practice, what would they be?
All right, rapid fire key points.
Let's start with dose limits. Quick recap.
Occupational annual 50 millisv TD, 50 millisv lens, 500 millisv organ skin extremities.
Public annual, 1 millisv effective dose.
Yep.
Hourly, 0.02 millisv in unrestricted area.
Declared pregnant worker. 5 millisv total term to fetus, 0.5 millisv per month guidance.
Got it. Medical event definition and reporting.
Dose threshold, e.g. 0.5 SV organ or 20% dose error, PLUS delivery error, wrong patient site modality, etc. Report, phone by next calendar day, written within 15 days.
Shielding factors and neutron needs.
Remember WTPD, workload use occupancy permissible limit distance. Neutrons need shielding above 10 MV, often using borated polyethylene, BPE, maybe with lead. Order matters for doors, BPE then lead.
Key regulations, frequencies, limits.
Sealed source leak tests and inventories every 6 months. Leak test failure limit, ADFEOs L2 removable contamination.
Detectors. The main difference.
Ion chambers, a quantitative dose rate measurement. GM counters, sensitive qualitative detection, yes, no radiation.
And the overarching ethics principle.
Patient's best interest first. Disclose conflicts, practice within scope, be accountable.
Perfect. That's a great high-yield summary. Now let's try to apply some of this with a quick board review blitz. Ready?
Let's do it. Hit me.
Question 1. According to U.S. NRC regulations, what is the annual occupational dose limit for the total organ dose equivalent, TODE, to the skin? A, 50 millisv, B, 150 millisv, B, 500 millisv, D, 1SD.
Okay. Skin is considered an individual organ tissue for this purpose. The limit for 2D to skin, hands, feet, or individual organs is higher than the TEAD. It's 500 millisieverts per year. So that's answer C.
Correct. 500 millisv or 50 rem. Question 2. A radioactive package is monitored. The maximum reading on the surface is 60 millibар 8R. The reading at 1 meter is 2 LOR 8RR. What shipping label is required? A, white IB. Yellow 2C, yellow 3D. Requires special permit, no label applies.
All right, let's check the thresholds. White eye needs surface 0.5 and undetectable at 1 meter. No, yellow 2 needs surface 50 millirr HR A and D, 1 meter yours 1 MRR HR. The surface reading here is 60 millirr ORS, which is greater than 50. The 1 meter reading is 2 LRRs, which is greater than 1. So it fails both conditions for yellow 2. Therefore, it must be yellow 3 because either the surface 50 OR or the 1 meter 1 condition is met. Both are met here, actually. Answer C.
Exactly. Yellow 3 it is. The transportation index would be 2. Question 3. For shielding calculations for a standard HDR brachytherapy treatment room, what use factor U is typically applied to the primary barrier calculation for the ceiling? A, 1, B, 12, C, 14, D.
Okay. HDR involves placing the source inside the patient, often near the center of the room. From the source's perspective, during treatment, it radiates isotropically, meaning radiation goes out in all directions. Therefore, all surrounding barriers, walls, floor, ceiling, are potentially irradiated by the primary source radiation, attenuated by the patient, but still considered primary. So the use factor for all these barriers in HDR room design is typically taken as U equals 1. Answer A.
Perfect. U equal 1 for HDR barriers. Last question. This one involves professionalism. You are checking the treatment plan for a patient about to be treated. You notice the prescription signed by the physician specifies treating the left lung, but the patient's signed consent form clearly indicates consent was given for treating the right lung. The planning system reflects the prescription left lung. What is the most appropriate immediate action? A. Proceed with treatment as prescribed, as the prescription is the legal order. B. Stop the treatment process immediately and notify the attending radiation oncologist of the discrepancy. C. Ask the patient to quickly sign a new consent form for the left lung. D. Inform the radiation therapist to treat, but make a note in the chart about the consent issue.
Wow, that's a major discrepancy and a huge safety concern. Treating the wrong site is a serious medical event. The consent form is a critical document reflecting the patient's agreement. You absolutely cannot proceed with treatment when there's such a fundamental conflict between the consent and the prescription plan. Trying to get a quick new consent under pressure is coercive and inappropriate. Ignoring it is negligent. The only correct and ethical action is to stop everything immediately and bring the discrepancy to the attention of the attending physician so it can be resolved definitively before any treatment is delivered. Patient safety first. So the answer is B.
Absolutely B. Stop and resolve. That's a critical safety check function. Well, those examples really show how intertwined all this information is. The physics numbers, the regulations, the ethical decision-making, it all comes together in clinical practice.
It really does, and mastering these fundamentals is just non-negotiable for being a safe and competent radiation oncology professional. It's a lot to absorb, I know.
It definitely feels like a huge amount, especially when you're studying for boards. You spend weeks cramming dose limits, half-lives, W sub R factors, signage rules.
And then 6 months after the exam, you find yourself thinking, wait, was the public limit 1 or 5 millisieverts? And what was that leak test limit again?
Exactly. You have to keep refreshing it. It's not just learn it once and forget it kind of stuff. You use it, or at least need access to it, constantly.
It's true. It's like building muscle memory for safety. But, that constant vigilance, that habit of double-checking, questioning things that don't seem right, knowing when to stop the line, that's what really builds a strong safety culture. The regulations are the minimum standard. The culture of safety is what truly protects patients.
Well said. This has been a really comprehensive run-through of these essential radiation protection and regulation topics. Hopefully breaking it down this way helps solidify some of those key concepts.
That was the goal, to provide a focused review, hitting the highlights and the critical details based on the core knowledge base in this area.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into radiation safety. Stay safe, keep learning, and keep asking questions.